My great-grandmother once shot a man over her shoulder while riding a horse. He died, and since she did it in self-defense, she walked free. I never knew my great-grandmother. She died when my mother was only 5 years old, but people who knew her well would tell me stories about her all the time. Everyone who grew up in the same village as my great-grandmother would tell me stories about how great she was, and there seemed to be hundreds of them. As soon as people found out I was Nadina Overa's great-granddaughter, they would follow up with, "Did you ever hear about the time?" And it almost felt like I knew her personally. The one story I hear the most often is the one about the witches of Conrado. The village of Conrado was tiny, with only a couple of people living in it, and it was mainly made up of multiple little ranchos. Most of the people who lived in Conrado were related, either by blood or by law, or they were close family friends with most of the other people in the village. My great-grandmother Nadina moved to Conrado when my grandmother was a child, to live with her sister Luna, whose husband had died. Luna had 3 daughters, Citlali, Juana, and Sylvia, who were all between the ages of 18 and 22 at the time. As the story goes, when Nadina moved to Conrado, Luna's eldest daughter Sylvia was engaged to a rich man from the city who was named Raul. Unfortunately for Sylvia, Raul's family hated her and merely saw her as a gold digger who was trying to steal the family's fortunes for herself and her sisters. Everyone in Conrado and all of the nearby towns knew who Raul and Sylvia were, and they had quickly become the main topic of gossip. It seemed like every week there was a new headline for people to discuss. Raul and Sylvia both refused to listen to anyone who warned them not to marry each other, and claimed that they were in love and that nothing was going to stop them from being together, especially not a few rumors. At this point in time, Nadina was still fairly new to the town and didn't really know anybody besides Luna's friends and family, but she was a witness to the countless rumors that were passed around about her niece. Sylvia's sisters, moms, aunts, and uncles were all against her marrying Raul. They were all worried about what her life would be like if she married into a family that hated her. But that wasn't the only reason. The women in Raul's family also had rumors floating around about them. Rumors that had been around for years, before his own mother was even born. The women in Raul's family were known as the witches of Conrado, and countless people were witnesses to their witchcraft. They were mostly known for performing rituals on their business competitors and people who in some way wronged or offended the family. Stories about the witches of Conrado were passed down in my family, so I knew a lot about them, and had heard some of the worst things they had done to other people in the nearby villages and towns. Everyone knew that the only reason why they had as much money and power as they did was due to the witches and their antics. A few months after Nadina moved to Conrado, Sylvia and Raul married, and Sylvia moved closer to his family. Weeks after the wedding, Sylvia started to get sick. At first, it was small things like headaches, but then the headaches got so bad she couldn't stand, and then her eyes sealed shut. Sylvia visited multiple doctors, and none of them could figure out what was going on with her. From then on, all her symptoms just kept getting worse. At one point, she woke up with her left calf stuck to the back of her thigh, and then with her fingers and toes webbed together, until it ultimately got so bad that Raul couldn't stand dealing with her anymore, and drove her to her mother's house, and dropped her off, and left. Things didn't change much though. Weird, unexplainable things kept happening to Sylvia, even though she was back at her mother's house. Until one day, when Nadina had enough. She was woken up one morning by Luna, who had noticed that Sylvia was missing. Together they went out to look for her, and ended up finding her up on a hill, laying in some cacti. After they got Sylvia home and cleaned her up, Nadina grabbed her rifle and made her way to Raul's mother's house. According to the neighbors, she arrived at the house and fired a shot into the air. before breaking down the front door and charging inside, where she found Raul's mother and his sisters, as well as a voodoo doll that resembled Sylvia. Nadina proceeded to threaten the witches of Conrado and even smack some of them around, eventually scaring them into healing Sylvia and leaving her alone. In exchange, Sylvia and Raul would get a divorce, and the witches would never harm the family again. It worked, and the witches knew that Nadina would come back and kill every single one of them if they didn't follow through on their word. Within a week, Sylvia was back to normal, and it was as if nothing had ever happened. About a month later, Raul's entire family had moved out of Conrado. They never said why they left, but everyone was pretty sure that Nadina had something to do with it. It seemed like everything was calm, and for a few years afterward, it really was. But then, word began to spread around about odd things that were happening in the nearby villages. People reported that their family members were having weird symptoms that couldn't be explained, and it also sounded a lot like what Sylvia had gone through. No one would specifically say who was doing these things, but everyone would mention that it was Las Brujas, and we immediately knew that they were the same witches that had been messing with Sylvia. The people of Conrado begged Nadina to get involved, but she refused, saying that she had made a deal with the witches, and they had held up their end. Of course, this made people upset, and a few of them tried to go after Nadina and her family, going as far as to attempt to kidnap family members. Nadina ended up sending my grandmother away to live with family in a different city in order to get her away from the madness that was happening in Conrado. And Luna did the same, sending away her only unmarried daughter as well. Nadina and Luna stayed in Conrado for a few more weeks as they attempted to get everything ready to leave as well, but they would soon find out that they were no longer able to. In fact, no one was, as the witches had placed some sort of curse on the people in Conrado that prohibited them from leaving. A few tried, but got only about a foot out of the village borders before they burst into flames and burned alive, or were torn apart by some invisible entity. No one ever got out or back in. After that, and slowly, the people of Conrado began to die. A larger percentage of the people committed suicide, and others simply gave up and waited for death to claim them. Towards the end, only Nadina and Luna were left, since the witches were holding up their end of the deal and didn't directly harm them. If either one of them tried to leave the village, they would simply find themselves back inside their homes after crossing the borders. It was like an endless loop. The witches were so adamant about keeping their word, in fact, that Luna attempted to commit suicide 3 times and was unable to die. Eventually, both Luna and Nadina died of old age in the village of Conrado, alone. Nothing was heard about the witches after that, and it seemed like all of Raul's family had fallen off the face of the earth. Luna and Nadina's kids grew up and married and had children of their own, and they passed down the stories of Nadina, making sure that she was never forgotten. Every time I hear the story of her death, I can't help but wonder how alone she must have felt, as she and her sister awaited death, alone, in the village of Conrado.